Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we are going to be taking a look at Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So, previously, we took a look at Watch Dogs Legion, another Ubisoft game, and we looked at how well it ran on a RTX 3080, as well as when you paired it with an older CPU, like what I have. I have an i7 6700K. We sat here, we ran the benchmarks, we tested the actual driving of the game, and we saw that the overall experience was limited heavily by CPU. Granted, that game just is extremely unoptimized like crazy, and you'll actually see that in this test from the brief testing I've done off camera. You'll see that in this, in some of the results that we get, is that Watch Dogs Legion is just it is just horribly unoptimized. But Assassin's Creed Valhalla should hopefully be more optimized than Watch Dogs Legion. At least we will find that out today. Okay, so here we are on the main menu. If we go into the actual options of the game here, I'm currently running it at 1080p right here. We're in the 160s on the main menu because I do actually run a 144Hz monitor and I have all kinds of VSync disabled. So we are just going to run this game at whatever it wants to run at frame rate wise. I don't want any limitations. But we are actually going to be running the game at 2160p or 4K for those of you guys who want to run this game at 4K to see how well an older CPU can handle a brand new video game on a brand new video card at 4K. We're going to be doing those tests as well. We are also running the game at ultra high settings here, sparing no expenses. If you're spending $800 on a graphics card or more on a graphics card, you're not going to want to sacrifice like environmental detail or something like texture quality or even lighting quality or anything. Like, you're not going to want to sacrifice. You're going to turn this game up to 11 and expect it to run. So that's what we're going to be doing today. The one thing I will note though is, even though this is touted as some kind of big extravagant next generation experience for next generation hardware, there's no ray tracing and no DLSS. As much as I don't really like DLSS, it'd be a nice feature to have. Same with ray tracing. Ray tracing in general, if they had like ray tracing shadows or I mean even reflections, because you spend like 90% of the game on water, I think. So ray tracing reflections would be a nice feature to have, but there's no ray tracing anywhere in here as far as I can tell. So a bit interesting in that sense, but not a deal breaker for me personally. But one thing you will note is that on the absolute ultra highest settings, we are only using 5.7 gigabytes of the 10 gigabytes of VRAM down here. So in terms of optimization already, from what we're seeing in terms of VRAM usage, we should be seeing a much smoother experience due to this game not taking up the entire 10 gigs of VRAM like Watch Dogs Legion did. Watch Dogs Legion was using like 9.8 gigabytes of VRAM on the 3080, so you were very heavily just limited by that, and not only that, but the CPU as well, and possibly even RAM, because even in Watch Dogs Legion, the regular RAM was being filled up by all the stuff it couldn't put in VRAM, so it was really just dominating your computer. So hopefully this game is going to be better. Going to be a bit better in that sense. We are going to run the benchmark, and we're going to do a little bit of the actual game itself. Don't worry, I've skipped past all of the introduction sequences and everything like that, so there's going to be no spoilers for this game. I have yet to play this game myself, so of course I don't want to spoil it for myself, nor you guys, so it's just going to be us running around the forest, so don't worry about spoilers in that sense. But let's go ahead and run the benchmark and just see how this game runs. We're going to have the MSI Afterburner numbers over here, and we're going to have the in-game stats on the right-hand side of the screen as well, so you have two sets of numbers to look at for more like at just as much real-time information as you can get. Let's go ahead and do it. Alright guys, here we are inside of the in-game benchmark. As you can see, we are currently getting about 70-ish FPS, roughly here and there, which is not actually too bad at 1080p maximum settings with an older CPU that's like, what, 4 to 5 years old, I think, somewhere in that range. We're using, what, 11.5 gigs of regular RAM and 7-ish gigabytes of the video memory, which is way less, way less than what Watch Dogs Legion was using, which is mighty impressive because I believe this world is bigger than Watch Dogs Legion, like far bigger, I think. I'm not an expert in map size for these two games, but I think I'd be willing to put money that Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a bigger world with more detail in it, and it can still use less VRAM. So that just goes to show you how absolutely unoptimized Watch Dogs Legion is currently. And the fact that we're running it at 1080p maximum settings, and we're getting 70 to 80 FPS. Whereas in Watch Dogs Legion, we were getting 30 FPS, 40 FPS. Like, we were really suffering with frames. And we're using about 70 to 80% of our CPU with over 90% of our GPU. So at 1080p, you're kind of bottlenecked on both ends. Like, you're using all of your GPU that you can, which is great. We're using all of our 3080, which is fantastic. But we're also using like 80% of our CPU as well. So if we had a better CPU, of course, our 75 average would go up to like an 85 or 95 average. So that's just, you know, let that be known that we are hardcore, again, CPU bottlenecked in that instance, but only by like, maybe I would say 20 FPS. I mean, that is a good chunk, but that's not like game breaking considering the fact that we're still averaging 75 FPS in 1080p. So if you're rocking 1080p like I am still, and you're rocking an old CPU, you can get a 3080 and call yourself good if all you want is 60 FPS. Like, you're good. One thing I do want to do now is I want to jump into the actual campaign side of things and run around in the forest. Again, no spoilers for the campaign, so if you're worried about that, you do not have to be worried about that side of things. I have skipped past all of the introduction sequences, and we are just going to jump into the actual, like, roaming around the forest stuff. Alright guys, here we are inside of the actual game itself. I've turned off all of the actual HUD and in-game overlays like that so that we don't have any mission tips or any kind of like, hey, go do this, go save those guys. Like, you don't have any of that stuff to avoid all spoilers. Now we can just look at the actual area itself that we are in. And I have to say, I am very surprised by this. You can see just how, not only how beautiful the game is, even at 1080p, right? But like, how optimized it is. We're using under 12 gigs of RAM and under 7 gigs of VRAM. In a world that I believe has more detail than Watch Dogs Legion and is bigger than Watch Dogs Legion. So, it's not to say that Watch Dogs Legion is a bad game, but it's just horribly optimized. Horribly optimized. There's no getting around that. That's just a fact at this point. Like, you can compare direct Ubisoft games, and one runs massively better than the other and is a bigger game than the other one. Like, that's just, yeah, there's no getting around that. Not bad at all. And of course, this is only indicative of like one area, because some areas have more grass or more fires or more particle effects or whatever. So, but I mean, still, this is a pretty good start. 80 FPS in an area like this, and it has just beautiful visuals. Absolutely beautiful visuals here. I have to give them that. Alright, so I think that's a good enough test for a 1080p. I'm just wandering around the flowers, and I gotta say, even the flowers, like, some games when they have like foliage that dodges around your character like this, they animate it at like 30 FPS. That's a problem that Horizon Zero Dawn has still, is they animate the foliage morphing at such a low frame rate that it's very distracting. But here, it's smooth. I like it. Yeah. It's smooth. There's no real downside to it. So I think that'll do it for 1080p. Let's go ahead and switch on over to 4K. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quit the game out. I'm going to resize the overlay in the top left corner, and then I'm going to switch to 4K so that way we can remove all bottlenecks from the VRAM and regular RAM, just like I had to do for Watch Dogs Legion, so we get as fair of a test as possible, completely restarting the entire test, but just in 4K. So I will see you guys in just a quick second. Okay guys, I think we're back. This game does not like running at 4K at all for me. At least for my setup, it doesn't like running at 4K. I have had to change so many settings. It never wants to quite stick. It always tried changing to my secondary monitor to where I had to actually turn that off for it to come up more reliably on my main monitor here. And then it kept changing my window mode to borderless, which, because I'm running a 1080p monitor, borderless window does not run 4K. It windows it down to 1080p again, so it wasn't actually 4K. So many different issues happened, and I actually already recorded the 4K testing part of it, but because of how the recording glitched out, it completely corrupted the file and was recording the wrong monitor or something like that. Like, it was such a bad experience that, just as a side note going in, if you are trying to run this game at 4K, be careful. I don't know how it's going to run if you actually have a 4K monitor, though. It might just work like a dream. So just as a side note, this has been a nightmare to try to get to work. I actually have my second monitor completely blacked out, turned off, so hopefully the recording looks okay. I've resized the actual overlay in the top left corner, and we can just go ahead and run the benchmark. So before I actually do that, let me go ahead and show you that we are running anti-aliasing on low, because of course you're on 4K. You don't need anti-aliasing really. So anti-aliasing on low, and everything else is still on the absolute highest settings. We are estimated at 6,200 megabytes of RAM, or 6.2 gigabytes of our 10 gigabytes of VRAM is the estimation. I mean, I'm anticipating about 8.5 gigs. Given what 1080p actually did in the actual benchmark and actual gameplay, I'm expecting it to be a little higher. But let's go ahead and jump into the actual benchmark. Alright guys, here we are inside of the in-game benchmark here, running at 4K, maximum settings, low anti-aliasing of course, or off I guess. It's running decently smooth. Getting about 50 to 60-ish FPS, depending on, you know, the scene and all that stuff. That's not bad. 50 to 60 FPS in 4K on an i7 6700K, which is a couple years old now, so it's definitely a bit dated. You'll get even higher FPS if you're on something newer. That's not bad, actually. That is not bad at all. We've completely removed, or not removed, but like lessened the entire CPU bottleneck, so we're only using about 60% of the CPU now. So that's nice to see. And we're still using about 95% of the GPU, so that is very good numbers to see. Very good numbers. So we're using all of our 3080. It is still going ham on rendering the 4K with all the absolute massive amount of pixels it's trying to render, but we're using less CPU, so that's good. Those are good numbers. Again, 50 to 60 FPS in 4K on this kind of a rig is not exactly bad. Not at all. Especially for running this game at the absolute highest settings, except for anti-aliasing, but that's, like, you don't need that because you're at 4K. That's not bad. That really isn't. So 53 FPS was our average there, and I love this little benchmark screen here because you can actually see that our 0.1% lows and our 1% lows were 35 and 42. So overall, because we've switched the bottleneck from a CPU bottleneck over to a GPU bottleneck because we're in 4K, we're actually getting a more stable, these peaks and these lows are closer together, so we're not having as many super far drops. So our minimum was 31, going from 53 to 31 is a bit of a dip, but not nearly as noticeable as if you were to go from like 80 in 1080p down to 20 or something like that. You know, like, it would be less noticeable and it'd be a smoother experience overall. So that's good to see. It's very good to see. We are using pretty much 8.5 gigabytes of VRAM like I thought we were going to use, which is significantly less than what Watch Dogs Legion was trying to use at 4K and in 1080p. So you can already get a sense, a glimpse at how optimized this game is compared to Watch Dogs Legion. But now let's go ahead and jump into the actual gameplay side of things again and see how it runs there. Alright guys, we are back in the actual campaign side of things again, right where we left off on the 1080p benchmark, and it is seemingly running smoother than the benchmark. This is why I like running the actual game versus a benchmark, or sometimes both, is so that way you can see just how maybe accurate or sometimes inaccurate a benchmark is compared to the actual game. Like the Watch Dogs Legion benchmark is extremely inaccurate because there's no driving portion of the benchmark, and that's where you're going to drop the most frames, is while you're driving in Watch Dogs Legion. So, but 4K, maximum settings, 60 FPS. 60 to 70 FPS in some situations. This is pretty good. 40 to 60% CPU usage, depending on what we're doing and where we're looking. I'm extremely surprised by this, actually. This is extremely playable. Extremely. Very pleasant. There's no frame dropping. There's no screen tearing. There's nothing like that. It is, by all means, a very enjoyable experience. Using just over 12 gigabytes of RAM and just under 8 gigabytes of video memory at the top there, you can see that this game is so much more optimized than Watch Dogs Legion was. So much more. Absolutely. On an older CPU, you're running 4K 60 FPS. Like, that's amazing. And at maximum settings, like the absolute max settings you can run, too. That's amazing. Like, wow. I'm just kind of speechless at that. That's amazing. And one thing I do have to mention, one, like, plus to this game is they actually have a performance metric thing over here on the right-hand side that shows you the last 30 seconds of gameplay right here. Shows you all the stats that it did before with a little frame time graph and everything of the last 30 seconds of gameplay. But what they also allow for this game, which is a huge thumbs up to Ubisoft for implementing this into their game, is if you're in the middle of gameplay just like this, you can press F1 and activate the overlay that you got while inside the benchmark. So you don't even have to do the benchmark to do a benchmark. It's so cool. This is a huge thumbs up for people like me. Huge thumbs up to Ubisoft for doing stuff like this. So I'm very pleasantly surprised at how well this is running, and even though they have a lack of DLSS or ray tracing, I would say this is an extremely pleasant experience, and maybe they'll add in ray tracing in the future, in like a patch or an update or a driver update or something. Like, maybe they will. That would be awesome, especially because the new consoles have the hardware accelerated ray tracing just like PC does, so there's no bottleneck anymore. I am very pleasantly surprised by how this is running. Very pleasantly surprised. But yeah, that's the 4K side of things. Yeah. I hope you guys have enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. This game is beautiful, runs amazing. It is a beefy game. Let me throw that out there. And in the final conclusion thoughts that I have, this is a beefy game in the way that Watch Dogs Legion was unoptimized. That's just it. That there's no like denying that at this point. Watch Dogs Legion is unoptimized and needs to be fixed. This game is, I would say, optimized. It is just very heavy. It's a very taxing game. This is a truly taxing game that has a lot going on and just a lot to render. So if you're on older hardware especially, you're going to be sacrificing some of the frames, or you're going to be using a lot of your CPU and stuff like that. Like, even my 3080 is being pegged at like 96% right now. So it's utilizing the full potential of the 3080 and my CPU and stuff. So that's really good to see. So, final thoughts. I'm happy with it. I don't know about you guys. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Thank you for watching. Thank you for hanging out. If you guys are watching this video and you guys got to this point here, it would mean a lot to me if you guys clicked that like button or subscribed or showed some kind of support in that sense, because this was so hard to make. Because of how finicky this game was trying to get it to run in 4K, it was really hard to make. I had to completely turn off my secondary monitor and just fiddle with a bunch of settings, and it took me like an hour to get the 4K test running. So if you guys wouldn't mind hitting that like button, I would appreciate that. As always, typical YouTube-y stuff, liking, commenting, subscribing, all that fun stuff. Thank you for hanging out. I appreciate you guys. You guys are awesome. And I will see you guys back here in the next video. Thank you guys for hanging out.